Good morning. I've been feeling a bit better, but struggling with some loneliness, which is okay. Okay. So I'm pretty sure we're halfway through chapter 4. No, chapter 5. Okay. Verbal and emotional abuse. The fact that verbal and emotional abuse can be traumatic is lost on many childhood trauma victims, though it is rarely lost on recovering victims of cult brainwashing who also are prone to developing CPTSD. Many survivors of verbal and emotional abuse never learn to validate its soul-damaging effects. They never accurately assign current time suffering to it. Attempts to acknowledge it are typically blindsided with thoughts that it was nothing compared to kids who were repeatedly beaten, who had it so much worse. As a child, I minimized my father's frequent face slapping by comparing it to my friend's father, who used to punch him. Much later, however, I finally realized that for me and many of my clients, verbal and emotional abuse damage us much more than our physical abuse. Ongoing assault with critical words systematically destroys our self-esteem and replaces it with a toxic inner critic that incessantly judges us as defective. Even worse, words that are emotionally poisoned with contempt infuse the child with fear and toxic shame. Fear and shame condition him to refrain from asking for attention, from expressing himself in ways that draw attention. Before long, he learns to refrain from seeking any kind of help or connection at all. Theoretical neurobiology of the critic. Unrelenting criticism, especially when it is ground in with parental rage and scorn, is so injurious that it changes the structure of a child's brain. Repeated messages of disdain are internalized and adopted by the child, who eventually repeats them over and over to himself. Incessant repetitions result in construction of thick neural pathways of self-hate and self-disgust. Over time, a self-hate response attaches to more and more of the child's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Eventually, any inclination toward authentic or vulnerable self-expression activates internal neural networks of self-loathing. The child is forced to exist in a crippling state of self-attack, which eventually becomes the equivalent of full-fledged self-abandonment. The ability to support himself or take his own side in any way is decimated. With ongoing parental reinforcement, these neural pathways expand into a large complex network that becomes an inner critic that dominates mental activity. The inner critic's negative perspectives create many programs of self-rejecting perfectionism. At the same time, it obsesses about danger and catastrophizes incessantly. Chapter 9 and 10 expand on shrinking and deconstructing these life-ruining programs. Until this is accomplished, the survivor typically lives in a varying degree of emotional flashback much of the time. The verbal and emotional layer of the abuse onion has many sub-layers of minimization. I have heard clients jokingly repeat numerous versions of this over and over. I know I'm hard on myself, but if I don't constantly kick my own ass, I'll be more of a loser than I already am. In fact, I really need you to come down on me if I try to get away with anything. A childhood rife with verbal and emotional abuse forces the child to thoroughly identify with the critic. That is, as if the critic is his whole identity. Disidentification from the critic is the fight of a lifetime. To liberate your identity from the toxic critic, you will have to repeatedly confront it for a long time. You will have greater success if you are prepared to forgive yourself for repeatedly collapsing back into the old habit of self-blame. Progress is always a gradual back and forth process. Ironically, A pernicious type of self-hate can constellate around the self-judgment that one is specifically defective because she cannot simply banish the critic. This is the typical toxic all-or-nothing thinking of the critic. Sadly, many survivors give up on fighting the critic before recognizing the myriad subtle ways it tortures them. Yet there is no more noble recovery battle than that which gradually frees the psyche from critical dominance. Until this happens to a significant degree, there is minimal development of the healthy, user-friendly ego. Let us look now at how emotional neglect alone can create a psyche-dominating critic. Emotional neglect, the core wound in complex PTSD. Minimization about the damage caused by extensive emotional neglect is at the core of the CPTSD denial onion. Our journey of recovering takes a quantum leap when we really feel and understand how devastating it was to be emotionally abandoned. An absence of parental loving interest and engagement. Especially in the first few years, creates an overwhelming emptiness. Life feels harrowingly frightening to the infant or toddler who is left for long periods without comfort and care. Children are helpless and powerless for a long time. And when they sense that no one has their back, they feel scared, miserable, and disheartened. Much of the constant anxiety that adult survivors live in is this still aching fear that comes from having been so frighteningly abandoned. Many survivors never discover and work through the wounds that correlate with this level. This happens because they over-assign their suffering to overt abuse and never get to the core issue of their emotional abandonment. As stated above, this is especially likely to occur with survivors who dismissively compare their trauma to those who are abused more noticeably and more dramatically. I find this painfully ironic because some people suffer significant active abuse without developing CPTSD. Typically, they are spared because there is one caretaker who does not emotionally neglect them. Traumatic emotional neglect occurs when a child does not have a single caretaker to whom she can turn in times of need or danger. CPTSD then sets in to the degree that there is no alternative adult, relative, older sibling, neighbor, or teacher to turn to for comfort and protection. This is especially true when the abandonment occurs 24/7, 365 days a year for the first few years. Growing up emotionally neglected is like nearly dying of thirst outside the fenced-off fountain of a parent's warmth and interest. Emotional neglect makes children feel worthless, unlovable, and excruciatingly empty. It leaves them with a hunger that gnaws deeply at the center of their being. They starve for human warmth and comfort. failure to thrive syndrome. When a child is continuously deprived of nurturing, caretaking, love starvation steadily increases and sometimes devolves into the failure to thrive syndrome. Failure to thrive is a term coined in the mid-20th century to describe the epidemic of baby deaths that occurred when new germophobic practices were introduced into hospitals. The new standard was that nurses were prohibited from holding babies for fear of contaminating them. Infant mortality immediately began to climb. Modern medical practice has abandoned this heartless approach because of the failure to thrive research. This research has since been corroborated by data from Eastern European orphanages, where there are insufficient staff to meet the contact comfort needs of babies. Modern medicine now accepts as scientific fact the principle that babies need a great deal of physical touch and nurturing in order to thrive. In my experience, failure to thrive is not an all-or-nothing phenomenon, but rather a continuum that stretches from abandonment, depression, to death. Many CPTSD survivors never thrive as babies. I believe that many suffered painful bouts of lingering near the end of the continuum that feels death-like. Several of my clients commonly have quipped that they feel like death warmed over when they are in a flashback. Moreover, I suspect that traumatized children do die from their abandonment. Perhaps their immune systems weaken and make more susceptible to diseases. Perhaps, as David Kalshed hints, they unconsciously gravitate toward lethal accidents to terminate their misery. One of my clients reported that this painful memory when we were processing a flashback that she was trapped in. She was 10, in a daze, and walked out between two parked cars into traffic. She was hit by a truck and it took months of hospitalization to save her leg. Her most tearful re-experiencing of this event was remembering how she woke up in the hospital and felt tremendous disappointment that she was still alive. Emotional hunger and addiction. The emotional hunger that comes from parental abandonment often morphs over time into an insatiable appetite for substances and/or addictive processes. Minimization of early abandonment often transforms later in life into minimizing that some survivors use to rationalize their substance and process addictions. Fortunately, many survivors eventually come to see their substance or process addictions as problematic, but many also minimize the deleterious effects of their addiction and jokingly dismiss their need to end or reduce their reliance on them. When the survivor has no understanding of the effects of trauma or no memory of being traumatized, addictions are often understandable. Misplaced attempts to regulate painful emotional flashbacks. However, many survivors are now in a position to see how self-destructive their addictions are. They are now old enough to learn healthier ways of self-soothing. Accordingly, substance and process addiction can be seen as misguided attempts to distract from inner pain. The desire to reduce such habits can therefore be used as motivation to learn the more sophisticated forms of self-soothing that CPTSD recovery work has to offer. As we will see in Chapter 11, grieving work offers us irreplaceable tools for working through inner pain. This then helps obviate the need to harmfully distract ourselves from our pain. The evolutionary basis of attachment needs. The human brain evolved during the hunter and gathering era that represents 99.8% of our time on this planet. For a child, safety from predators during these times depended on being in very close proximity to an adult. Even the briefest loss of contact with a parental figure could trigger panicky feelings, as beasts of prey only need seconds to snatch away an unprotected child. Fear hardwired in the child as a healthy response to separation from a productive adult. Fear also linked automatically with the fight response, so that the infant and toddler would automatically cry angrily for attention, help, and cessation from abandonment. CPTSD-inducing families, however, loathe angry crying, and many can find professionals to back them up for routinely leaving babies and very young children to cry it out on their own. In most dysfunctional families, parents disdain children for needing any kind of help or attention at all. Moreover, even the most well-intentioned parent can seriously neglect their child by subscribing to the gregarious 20th century wisdom that kids need quality time. Quantity does not matter. When children experience long periods of being powerless to obtain needed connection with a parent, they become increasingly anxious and upset and depressed. In CPTSD engendering families, the absence of care and concern is extreme. A caretaker is rarely or never available for support, comfort, or protection. If this is what you suffered, you then grew up feeling that no one likes you, no one ever listened to you or seemed to want you around. No one had empathy for you, showed you warmth, or invited you closeness. No one cared about what you thought, felt, did, wanted, or dreamed of. You learned early that no matter how hurt, alienated, or terrified you were, turning to a parent would do nothing more than exasperate your experience of rejection. When caretakers turn their back on a child's need for help and support, her inner world becomes an increasingly nightmarish amalgam of fear, shame, and depression. The child who is abandoned in this way experiences the world as a terrifying place. Over time, the child's dominant experience of herself is so replete with emotional pain and so unmanageable that she has to disassociate, self-medicate, act out aggression against others, or act in aggression against the self to distract from it. The situation of the abandoned child further deteriorates as an extended absence of warmth and protection gives rise to the cancerous growth of the inner critic as described above. The child projects his hope for being accepted onto self-perfection. By the time the child is becoming self-reflective, cognition starts to arise that sounds like this: I'm so despicable, worthless, unlovable, and ugly. Maybe my parents would love me if I could make myself like those perfect kids I see on TV. In this way, the child becomes hyper-aware of imperfections and strives to become flawless. Eventually, she roots out the ultimate flaw, the moral sin of wanting or asking for her parents' time or energy. Intrinsic to this process is noticing more and more hypervigilantly how her parents turned their back or became angry or disgusted whenever she needed anything, whether it be attention, listening, interest, or affection. Emotional neglect alone causes children to abandon themselves and to give up on the formation of a self. They do so to preserve an illusion of connection with their parents and to protect themselves from the danger of losing that tenuous connection. This typically requires a great deal of self-abdication, the forfeiture of self-esteem, self-confidence, self-care, self-interest, and self-protection. Moreover, endangerment programs proliferate in the critic as the child learns that he cannot ask his parent to protect him from dangers and injustices in the outside world, never mind in the home. His only recourse is to become hypervigilant about things that can go wrong. His critic compiles lists of possible calamities, especially those that are graphically portrayed in the media. The media gives the critic of the abandoned child much fodder to play with. She may be exposed daily to hours of programs that glorify sarcasm, backbiting, and bullying. Moreover, news programs with a 90% content of bad news fill her head with impressions that the world is predominantly hostile and dangerous. Even worse, emotionally neglectful parents commonly abandon their children to their favorite babysitter, the TV. Through such neglect, the child's consciousness eventually becomes overwhelmed with the process of drasticizing and catastrophizing. Drasticizing and catastrophizing are critic processes that lead the child to constantly rehearse fearful scenarios in a vain attempt to prepare himself for the worst. This is the process by which CPTSD, with its overdeveloped stress and toxic shame programs, sets in and becomes triggered by a plethora of normally innocuous stimuli. Most notably of these stimuli are other people, especially unknown people or people even vaguely reminiscent of the parent. Over time, the critic comes to assume that all other people are dangerous and automatically triggers the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response whenever a stranger or unproven other comes into view. This people are dangerous process typically devolves into the social anxiety that is frequently a symptom of CPTSD. In worst case scenarios, it manifests as a social phobia and agoraphobia. In my opinion, agoraphobia is rarely a fear of open spaces. It is instead a disguised form of social phobia. It is the fear of going out lest you run into someone or anyone. Abandonment stultifies emotional and relational intelligence. As stated above, emotionally abandoned children often devolve into experiencing all people as dangerous, no matter how benign or generous they may in fact be. Even love coming their way reverberates threateningly on a subliminal level. Unconsciously, they fear that if they momentarily trick someone into liking them, the forbidden prize will vanish once their social perfectionism inevitably fails and exposes their unworthiness. Moreover, when this occurs, they will be triggered even more deeply into the abandonment melange. Emotional intelligence and its cohort, relational intelligence, are forced into developmental arrest by abandoning parents. Children never learn that a relationship with a healthy person can be comforting and enriching. The ability to open to and benefit from love and caring from others often lays dormant and undeveloped. Moreover, the appropriate management of the normal emotions that recurrently arise in significant relationships is never modeled for them. Emotional intelligence about the healthy and functional aspects of anger, sadness, and fear lies fallow. Minimizing emotional abandonment. As with physical abuse, effective work on wounds of verbal and emotional abuse can sometimes open the door to deminimizing the awful impact of emotional neglect. I sometimes feel the most for my clients who were only neglected, because it is so difficult to see neglect as hardcore evidence. Most people remember little before they were 4 years old, and by that time much of this kind of damage is done. It typically takes some very deep introspection work to realize that current time flashback pain is a recreation of how bad it felt to be emotionally abandoned. The remembering and deminimizing of the impact of emotional neglect can take a long time. It is typically an intuitive piecing together of a lot of clues. The puzzle is often solved when a critical mass of childhood reconstruction is reached. Sometimes this fosters an epiphany that neglect is indeed at the core of present time suffering. Sometimes this epiphany brings a great relieving certainty that fragile self-esteem, frequent flashbacks, and recurring reenactments of unsupportive relationships were caused by the closed hearts of our parents. I sometimes regret that I did not know what I know about this kind of neglect when I wrote my first book. I wish I had not over-focused on the role of abuse in my childhood trauma. It is so hard to convey this to a client whose critic minimizes and shames them for their plight by comparing them unfavorably to me. I didn't have it anywhere near as bad as you. My mother never hit me. How ironic that this typically involves a feeling sense in me that the worst thing that happened to me by far was growing up so emotionally abandoned. In fact, it was not until I learned to assign the pain of numerous current time emotional flashbacks to the abject loneliness of my childhood that I was able to work effectively on the repetition compulsion that led me into so many neglectful relationships. And once again, this is not to deny or minimize the CPTSD-inducing traumatization that does come from each and every type of physical abuse. Every type of abuse, physical, sexual, verbal, and emotional. Practicing a vulnerability. Emotional abandonment is healed by the type of real intimacy that we have been discussing. And once again, real intimacy depends on us showing up in times of vulnerability. Deep level recovering occurs when we successfully connect with a safe enough other during the flashback times of feeling trapped in the fear, shame, and depression of the abandonment melange. In this vein, I had to painstakingly practice showing up in my pain for years. At first, I could only do this infrequently. I was too habituated to my childhood default position of hiding or camouflaging with substances whenever I was in the grip of the abandonment melange. Yet I drew strength to increase my practice from a growing distaste for the social perfectionism of my people-pleasing codependence. I somehow knew my loneliness would never decrease until I took the risk to see if certain well-chosen others would accept me in all aspects of my experience, not just the shiny ones. And of course, like most survival, I was ignorant at first that I was even experiencing the emotional pain of the abandonment. How could I help but conceal it? Moreover, even after considerable demonization of my childhood abuse neglect picture, I was still convinced that everyone but my therapist would find me abhorrent if I shared about my flashback feelings. Furthermore, my trust of my therapist also wavered quite a bit at first, especially during my deepest flashbacks. Gratefully, sufficient positive experiences with my therapist eventually emboldened me to bring my authentic vulnerability to others, select and gradually proven relationships, where I found the acceptance, safety, and support that previously I would not have known to wish for. There are limitations of the analogy of the onion. Later recovery does typically involve working at various levels at the same time. Demonization is a lifetime process. Revisiting a central issue of our abandonment picture sometimes impacts us even more deeply than it did at first. One such occasion left me reeling with a certain knowledge that getting hit felt preferable to being abandoned for long hours outside my depressed mother's locked bedroom door. I would pound on the door even though I knew she would explode because I just could not bear the isolation. I have known about the latter for quite some time now, and yet writing about it brings up some new bittersweet tears. Bittersweet tears are not uncommon in the ongoing work of peeling the layers of the denial onion. The tears are bitter because we realize the abandonment was even more devastating than we previously realized. And then the tears are sweet because they validate the truth of the recollection and put the blame where it truly belongs. And then they may be bitter again because the horrible abandonment happens over and over again when we were so young and legitimately needed so much help. And then they can turn sweet again as in tears of gratitude, because a person often comes through this kind of depth work with an enhanced compassion for what she suffered and a healthy pride about having survived. In my latest experience of this type of grieving, my sweet tears came from realizing that I do regularly experience good enough love and safety in relationships. And then my tears were bitter again because I can still emotionally flash back to that bereft state of feeling stranded from the comfort of others, even occasionally from my wife and son. And then my tears are